Welcome to ADRN online seminar. This is the titled The Voice of Solidarity for the Restoration of Democracy in Myanmar. I'm Suk-jung Lee, and I'll moderate this webinar. As we all know, the Myanmar had been ruled by the military ever since it waged the first coup in 1962. So military has been very strong power until 2011. However, the civil society in Myanmar has been also very active to get their democracy. So we remember the 1974 struggle and the 1988 demonstration, and again, 2007 Chaperone Revolution. So finally, based on 2008 Constitution, civil society and military had a pact democracy, namely sharing power. So that's why we call the democratic transition of Myanmar is not complete. So it was very, in a sense, very delicate situations. However, watching the 2015 election and again 2020 election, November last year, National League for Democracy won the election, and second time last year with such a big landslide victory. So many people, our panelists and myself, expected maybe full democratic transition, can be possible in near future. However, the result was the opposite. There was a military coup d'etat the February 1st, and they charged the previous election was flawed. And of course, the people in Myanmar fought back with the civil disobedience movement in order to get back their democracy. However, in a military crackdown these protesters, and there is about more than 750 people died, and they got killed, and many of them are young people, university students, and even young children. That's very heartbreaking. This is a very important moment because America and EU and several countries in Asia, and also ASEAN, condemned such horrible actions. However, there is no good effect. And we saw the ASEAN meeting last Saturday, right? And they made the statement asking 4 points. If I read, ASEAN secretariat issued a statement. They said it's based on consensus. So the immediate cessation of violence and constructive dialogue to reach a peaceful solution, the appointment of a special envoy from ASEAN, and humanitarian assistance. That's the 4 points of demand. However, the military in Myanmar is saying the peace and the end of protest is first before they engage in constructive dialogue. So it's very pessimistic prospect, but it's a very important timing to discuss how especially Asian democracies can help the Myanmar to get back to the normal path for the gradual democratic transitions. So we invited panelists from 4 Asian democracies, from Japan, from South Korea, and from India, and from Indonesia. And 4 these countries are also one of top 10 the countries the Myanmar is exporting and also importing. Before we engage in the live discussion with 4 excellent eminent scholars, we have again very good and very well-known keynote speaker. And he is Jose Ramos Horta, and he is a very well-known political leader, and he was very much very strong political activist, fought for the independence and peace of his country. And for that effort, he got awarded Nobel Peace Prize for Peace in 1996. And Ramos Horta served as Prime Minister of East Timor from 2006 to 2007, and then as President from 2007 to 2012. And now he is the member of the Council of State, and also he is a steering committee chair of World Movement for Democracy. So without further ado, let me invite former President Ramos Horta to deliver his speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. This is José Ramos Horta, a former president of Timor-Leste. Since independence of Myanmar, they were never invaded, threatened by any neighbor. There was no threat to the independence, territorial integrity of Myanmar. So in 2020, 2021, we arrived at a situation where the army, as always, wages a war on its own people. And that's what they have done for the past 60 years. Suu Kyi won the elections in November 2020 against the expectations of the Burmese military, because they thought after 5 years of Suu Kyi government, unable to resolve the Rohingya problem, with hundreds of thousands fleeing to Bangladesh, with Suu Kyi demonized around the world, particularly by Western liberals. She was ostracized, demonized, all her diplomas, certificates were taken away from her, from UK to Republic of Ireland to Canada. This woman, Suu Kyi, brave woman who led her people against the military for over 2 decades, feted, celebrated in the West, suddenly found herself brought down by the Western pedestal. I was one of the very few in the world to, time and again, try to explain to my interlocutors in the West, in the European Union, do not demonize Suu Kyi. She has very little power, as stipulated in the Constitution, and real little power on the ground. The military watching her every day. The conflict with the Rohingya was exacerbated on purpose. The military overreaction to the killings in August 2017 by the Rohingya militants, the overreaction, the disproportionate use of force was deliberate, was calculated, in part to provoke Suu Kyi into criticizing the military actions. Suu Kyi was fully conscious of the intentions, the strategy of the military. So she refused to criticize the violence inflicted on the Rohingya that caused 800,000 to flee the Rakhine state into Bangladesh. And for this, she was criticized, demonized by the West. And so the military were calculating. Suu Kyi has failed on the internal security front to resolve the Rohingya problem. On the international front, she was brought down. The first expectation, miscalculation of the military, is that Suu Kyi would lose the election in November 2020, or at least her overwhelming majority in the previous election, 2015, would be dented. Well, she won even more of a landslide than before. And what were the fears of the military? that with Suu Kyi consolidating her powers, she would gradually reform the Burmese armed forces into a professional armed force, similar to how Indonesian military transitioned from dictatorship in 98-99 to one today of a more modern professional army, separated from politics and the businesses. The Indonesian military, like the Chinese military, the Thai military, they own banks, they own factories, industries. China began this reform many years ago. Thailand, not yet. You still see in the streets of Bangkok the signs in a military bank, but it's much less scale. Indonesia had the same, today much less. Myanmar, the clique of the military, misruling the country for the past 60 years, they own almost everything, including your shadow, including the shoes you wear. That's their fear, that they would lose decades of absolute control of Myanmar's lives and the economy. They staged a coup. They also miscalculated. They thought Donald Trump would have won the election in November. They were shell-shocked that President Biden won the election, so they had to accelerate, reversing the democratic situation in Myanmar. If such a coup had happened in Africa, there would have been immediate universal condemnation in Africa, and the country concerned, its membership in the African Union and the regional organization in Africa would be suspended. That's what the Charter of the African Union says. The Africans do no longer tolerate coups by anyone, any individual, any country perpetrating a military coup in Africa is suspended from membership and indicted for war crimes, crimes against humanity, if the coup is followed with violence. Well, look at ASEAN, supposedly the most credible, effective regional organization, in Asia at least. Every ASEAN summit, the major dialogue partners, the United States President, the Chinese President, Prime Minister of Japan, President of Korea, the President of the European Commission, Prime Minister of Canada, Australia, President Putin, all descend on the host capital to participate in the dialogue. But this is the ASEAN organization that is so feeble, toothless, still hanging on to their so-called internal affairs, sovereignty to kill, to murder, sovereignty to stage a coup in this 21st century in the heart of ASEAN. I understand the difficulties of ASEAN. ASEAN is not the European Union. ASEAN is not even the African Union. The ASEAN is not even the Organization of Latin American States, whereby a sacrosanct principle that unites all is respect of human rights, for justice, rule of law, and opposition to coups. Infringement on these principles and values cause automatic suspension of membership, condemnation, swift condemnation, and economic sanctions by the regional organization itself. Well, this is not the case with ASEAN, because look at the membership. The Burmese over the years, they witnessed, they followed, they studied the Thai military experiments of coups, one coup after another in Thailand the last 10 years. The regional organization ASEAN, the international community, literally turned a blind eye to the coups in Thailand. So the Burmese military learned from it. They say, well, after all, it seemed to be simple. We do a coup, then we promise new elections, we orchestrate a new constitution, and the one who did the coup becomes the prime minister, the president of Myanmar. That's the lessons they got from Thailand. And they are gathering, trying to gather, unable so far, the ASEAN leaders to master their strength, their credibility, to reverse the coup in Myanmar. There cannot be fait accompli. So far, only Malaysia and Indonesia have issued stronger criticisms of the situation in Myanmar, of the violence. All other countries in ASEAN, in the region, China, have been silent. Republic of Korea has been very forward, has been very blunt, courageous. I congratulate President Moon, the leadership in Korea, including the private sector companies that are freezing new investments in Korea. There cannot be any condoning silence on these terrible massacres in the heart of ASEAN in this beginning of 2021. We cannot be accomplices. And the major challenge for all of us as people in the communities of Southeast Asia, of East, Northeast Asia, in Asia, is how messages are delivered to the leaders, the states, that they cannot condone with their silence, with their sense of realpolitik and pragmatism, the killing of innocent people. But the situation in Myanmar is a confrontation between the military and the people. The vast majority of the people, from students, youth, bankers, civil servants, artists, there is no one in Myanmar that has not joined the demonstrations, and the killings are continuing. Ladies and gentlemen, these are my remarks, my message to you, and my appeal to you is to raise your voice, pressure on ASEAN, on your respective governments in your respective countries, to impose thorough economic, financial sanctions on Myanmar military, on their cronies, on their families. Freeze their bank accounts wherever you find them. Complete ban of weapons exports. The two main culprits are China and Russia. They are the providers of weapons to the military in Myanmar. Travel ban on all Myanmar officials, including the new appointments made by Myanmar government, the military, as diplomatic envoys to countries, like to London. International community, including Republic of Korea, Japan, and others, should continue to accept as valid the credentials of the ambassadors appointed by the legitimate government that was in power as a result of the election 2015 and won the elections of November 2020. That's the only way to show how serious we all are against military coups and the massacres. In addition, last but not least, I hope that ICC, the International Criminal Court, the new prosecutor that will take over in June, will issue arrest warrant against the leader of Myanmar military and all associated with him. I thank you all for participating in this Zoom conference, in this virtual conference on Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Ramos Horta, he kind of pointed out the weakness of regional organization, including ASEAN, in our region, much even weaker than the African Union in addressing this kind of the violence against human rights and rule of law. And he suggested concrete ideas like economic sanctions, the bank account freeze, and also the banning export of weapons to Myanmar and travel ban. And also he called the governments of this region to recognize national unity government and also bring these military leaders to International Criminal Court. So I think we need to, respond to the keynote speaker's demand. We have a very excellent panels from 4 Asian democracies, and Maiko Ichihara at Hitotsubashi University from Japan, and Professor Hanjun Kim at Korea University of South Korea, and we have Evan Laksmana, the CSIS Indonesia, and also Niranjan Sahu, Senior Research Fellow at Observer Research Foundations. So welcome to this webinar. So I'm going to run the discussion by 2 rounds. So each panelist can address 5 minutes each. The first question is why each panelist describe what your government has done so far, maybe bilaterally and also multilaterally, to this horrible situation in Myanmar since the coup d'etat of February. So let me invite Michael to speak first. So Michael, it's your turn.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Dr. Lee. My name is Maiko Ichihara, Associate Professor of Hitotsubashi University, Japan, and a visiting scholar at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm grateful for the leadership of Dr. Lee for holding this much needed event. Within the time constraint, let me briefly touch upon the moves of the government and the civil society in Japan. Excuse me. The essence of the Japanese government's move regarding the Myanmar crisis is first, quiet diplomacy, and second, humanitarianism within constraints. And this time around, the humanitarian aspect colors Japanese diplomacy a little more than before, but in a way that does not stand out. The Japanese government is seeking to maintain its quiet diplomacy, which is to show its stance only in a quiet manner. The purpose is to maintain the route for negotiation with the Tatmadaw. And consequently, we tend to have difficulty grasping the government's positions and actions. In order to keep its action low profile, the Foreign Ministry sometimes releases related information only in Japanese, and sometimes it does not do so in its own, and instead let former diplomats do the job on a private capacity. Therefore, the key to reading their stance is to read what is not written in their statements, and also to read the interviews of and articles written by the former top leadership of the foreign ministry's related departments. My take is as follows. They have emitted constant messages that Japan does not acknowledge the Tatmadaw-led government as a legitimate government and is highly alarmed by serious human rights abuses by the Tatmadaw. And they have maintained 3 principal positions that they call, first of all, stop the suppression of citizens. Secondly, release the NLD top leadership. And third, restore the democratic process in Myanmar. The Japanese government has had negotiations with the Tatmadaw officials, but they do not seem to be using sanctions as a leverage in the negotiations. Once again, it is because they hope to keep the quiet diplomacy. This is a limitation in Japan's approach to solving the crisis in Myanmar. Japan seems more at ease to relegate itself to the sidelines and support ASEAN's role in resolving the crisis. That is why a series of meetings between foreign ministers and senior deputies have been held between Japan on one hand and Indonesia, Singapore, the Philippines, and Vietnam on the other, in the lead up to the ASEAN Emergency Summit on April 24th and after then. Does Japan sanction the Tatmadaw? The answer is yes and no. They terminate an ODA to Myanmar to show Japan's opposition to the Tatmadaw's approach in this crisis, but they do so only quietly and not necessarily as a bargaining chip or even as a sanction. They quietly terminated already new ODA projects in early March, taking a position as if there were no new ODA projects planned for this year. A recent interview of a former Japanese ambassador to Myanmar appeared in the Nikkei Asian Review seems to show that there has already been a discussion on termination of all the ODA projects, not only new ones. However, even if the government is to put an end to it, it will do so quietly. But the Japanese government's concern on this humanitarian crisis can be seen in the fact, for example, that they provided emergency aid of $19 million in early March for internally displaced persons and those Myanmar refugees flee to Bangladesh in order to provide support for their medical and human health care, shelter, and food. In order not to make it the support for the Tatmadaw, the aid is provided through international organizations such as the International Red Cross, the World Food Program, and the International Organization for Migration. When it comes to Japanese civil society, there has been a very dynamic activism among them, particularly among the youth. University students, both in Tokyo and Kyoto, have been leading multiple signature campaigns to support CDM and have conveyed their signatures to Japanese parliamentarians in order to request the Japanese government's support for the CDM. They have also been conducting fundraising campaigns, including through crowdfunding mechanisms as well. Social science researchers studying Myanmar, Southeast Asia, and development also support these initiatives. Thus, overall, while Japan might seem quiet from outside the country, there is really a wide variety of vibrant support of the people for the people in Myanmar, both in the government and the civil society in Japan. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And that's a very wonderful story to hear about the Japanese government quiet diplomacy. Let's move to South Korea. Professor Kim, in case of South Korea, I think they are more like our government is engaged in assertive diplomacy, but I don't know, this diplomacy is actually heard to the Myanmar government or not. So why don't you explain what the Korean government has done so far?
Sure, thank you. I'll discuss Korea government's response and then the civil society support. The Korean government response was, as mentioned, it was quick and then assertive. The measure can be divided into two. The first, the official statements, and then several meetings. The Korea issued 4 statements on Myanmar, SNS messages by President and Prime Minister, and then the National Assembly also has adopted a resolution condemning the military. The tone of criticism and then urgency increased over these different statements. And then the most recent one states that the Korea is deeply shocked over the loss of the many innocent civilians and then strongly condemn the continuing the brutal violence. Top-level government officials had also meetings with the Myanmar ambassador and then students and then the workers from Myanmar to hear and then deliver the concerns. These meetings, along with the official statements, sent a clear message and a strong message. Second, immediately after the first large-scale massacre, the government took effective steps of bilateral, diplomatic, and then economic sanctions So far, 6 measures are in place. The first, the government suspended the new exchange and then cooperation in the field of defense and security. And second, the government stopped exporting the military supplies and then decided to strictly control the export of the dual-use material. And then third, the government is under review of ODA while continuing those with the humanitarian purposes, of course. The fourth, the government took measures to extend the stay of Myanmar national until the situation is getting better. And then the officials say it was one of the first measures took by Korean government around when you compare with the world. And then the five, the government raised the travel advisory to all areas of Myanmar. And lastly, the government was in a consult with the companies working with the military related cooperation businesses. And one of them, the POSCO, the steel producers, decided to terminate the joint venture with the military related businesses. At the same time, the civil society is very active in supporting Myanmar, which can be also divided into about 5 different actors. The first, the religious organization, especially Buddhists, but also the Christians, quickly made a statement of support. And then about 240 organizations have created an umbrella network in Korea, and then now it's in work. This network, along with the individual citizens and local governments and then local parliaments, are supporting the protesters and then collecting the funds. And second, the democratic movement organization are declaring the solidarity with the protesters. Among them, the most active one is the May 15th Gwangju Democratic Movement Organizations. And then the Victims Association, and then the Citizens of Gwangju. Well, it is mainly due to the similarity between the two events, the coup, resistance, and massacres. But this link is not a sudden one. Between the Myanmar and then Gwangju, there had been already established relations about a decade ago, especially with the May 15th Memorial Foundation. The third, the students and NGOs, and notably the PSPD, the People's Solidarity for the Participatory Democracy, are protesting in front of the companies whose investments are tightly linked to the military businesses, and also in front of the Myanmar embassy, and then also in the Indonesia embassy because of the ASEAN meeting. They pressure these companies and then the embassies to sometimes to stop what they're doing or to disinvest from the military related businesses. The fourth, the both traditional but also the new media such as SNS are helping to spread the word and the support of the protesters. And then one of the media had a provided outlet for the local Myanmar reporters, and some SNS users are actively, usually the activists who once worked in Myanmar, are continuing posting the first-hand stories. And finally, the NGOs and the research institute and the scholars show support of the democracy, signing petitions, publicizing their research on the fairness of the elections based on the survey research, and then having a various events supporting the protesters. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Let's move it to Indonesia and Evan. Your country has been very active in front stage of diplomacy, and your president has mentioned after the end of ASEAN meeting last weekend that the current situation is not acceptable, and you invited Minang flying to represent the country despite the controversy and oppositions. So what the current situation and your government is aiming at?
Thank you again for the opportunity and for inviting me this morning. A couple of things I think about Indonesia's approach to the crisis in Myanmar. First of all, we have to understand that Indonesia, unlike some of its Southeast Asian neighbors like Singapore or Thailand, we do not have any significant leverage over Myanmar. We don't have significant investments, both political, diplomatic, or even economic and security ties. So we actually don't have a lot of levers to pull. But we do believe, however, that Indonesia could not just sit idly by and watch the whole thing unfold. So which is why I think in the early days of the coup, the foreign minister has taken a very proactive role in trying to get support from regional powers, from Japan, from India, from Russia and China, as well as the US. And then within that framework, she still believes that the best way to address the crisis in Myanmar is through an ASEAN-led framework or an ASEAN-led mechanism. At this point, there is no other international concerted diplomatic option on the table. There is no UN option. There is no great power option. This is it. This is the only option we have right now. The first informal meeting for the Southeast Asian foreign ministers were organized about a month or so after the coup, which was very difficult to organize, because once we made a decision that it has to be done through ASEAN, we have to work within the constraints and confines of ASEAN. First of all, there is no membership expulsion scheme or framework within the ASEAN Charter. So we cannot actually do that. We have been talking about suspension of activities or disinvitation or reducing in terms of interaction, but there is no membership expulsion. Secondly, Indonesia has taken the lead, but the current chair of ASEAN is Brunei. The Secretary General of ASEAN is also from Brunei. So everything has to depend on the role of the Secretary General and the ASEAN chair. Indonesia cannot call a meeting. It has to be the chair that issues the invitation. So we have to work within the constraints of ASEAN, which is why the whole process took 3 months before we have an ASEAN leaders meeting. Subsequently, I think with the ASEAN leaders meeting, this was following up the call from President Jokowi himself on the 3rd week of March that ASEAN needs to convene a special meeting, and he has discussed that option with the chair, the Sultan of Brunei. But it took another round of negotiations, because in the ASEAN system, you cannot convene a leaders meeting without a preparatory series of meetings between the senior officials and then the foreign minister. So there were a few rounds of negotiations. In the meantime, I think it should be noted that publicly speaking, Indonesia as well as a few others have said that we build communications with all parties. We don't just talk with the SAC, but we talk to all parties. So the issue of recognition, I think, is interpreted as conferring legitimacy, when in fact the whole goal of the ASEAN leaders meeting, first and foremost, is to end violence. And who is the party doing the violence? The military. So we don't call on the military as the representative of Myanmar. In fact, when he arrived in Jakarta, the presidential press release referred to him as the commander of the armed forces, not as the president of Myanmar. When he drove from the airport to the ASEAN secretariat, his car did not fly the flag of Myanmar. So there is no legitimacy being conferred of any kind to the senior general. He was invited as the commander of the armed services, because we want to convey first and foremost that violence must stop. So the person or the entity doing the violence is the military, not the National Unity Government. To invite the National Unity Government would not only prevent the summit from happening, but it would be also quite difficult to end the violence from that standpoint. So secondly, I think where we are right now in terms of the 5-point consensus agreed to the meeting is obviously very tricky right now, because in the last few days we've seen some wavering and some dithering from both sides in Myanmar, from the SAC as well as from the NUG. But right now, nobody is saying that the ASEAN option is dead. The 5-point consensus is an opening gambit. We have to build on that opening gambit for an eventual breakthrough. So the 5-point consensus, 3 of those are the outcomes that ASEAN would like to achieve: the ending of violence, the delivery of humanitarian assistance, and the beginning of an inclusive political dialogue of all the parties concerned. These are the 3 outcomes to achieve. The 2 a point of consensus outside of these 3 is the mechanics to deliver those outcomes, which is the role of the special envoy of the ASEAN chair, yet to be announced, as well as a visit by the ASEAN chair, and the envoy to Myanmar. So those 2 are the initial mechanics to deliver the three outcomes. Right now, I think because of time, we obviously need to announce who the envoy is as soon as possible. We need to provide the framework as soon as possible, and then arrange a visit in which, before the visit can happen, they should end violence and release political prisoners, which is why the discussion on political prisoners were made at the leaders' meeting, but was not part of the consensus, because the main goal is the violence, and we were thinking of how we can include the discussion on political prisoners as part of our next sequence before the visit. The problem with the political prisoner issue is that some people or some parties in Myanmar consider yes, the students and the protesters should be released, but there are complications about the role of Aung San Suu Kyi. Whether or not she should be a part of this, whether or not her release would complicate the negotiations between NUG and the ethnic armed organizations is something that we should look out for. Because in fact, in the in the press releases of the NUG representatives, there is no mention of Aung San Suu Kyi anymore. There is a mention of release of political prisoners, but not Aung San Suu Kyi. Again, the goal right now is for the parties in Myanmar to embrace the ethnic armed organizations. And I think hopefully the idea is that once we secure the ending of violence and release of some prisoners, then an ASEAN delegation can come and visit, provide a needs assessment, talk to the parties on the ground beyond the SEC, and then we can establish a task force to provide both the humanitarian aid delivery, the observance of the cessation of violence, and then hopefully the beginning of a political dialogue. But this is not, the 5-point consensus is not a final resolution. It is wrong, I think, to present it as our way to address the issue. It is the beginning of how we can start a framework, hopefully with the help and support of our regional partners, as well as the international community. We can hopefully put this 5 consensus into play soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. Your mentioning of NUG, now talking about Aung San Suu Kyi, was very interesting point. Maybe we can discuss it later. And Niranjan, well, you know, Evan has mentioned Indonesia does not have a leverage to Myanmar, and India neither. But you are the largest democracy, and despite the rising number of the COVID-19 infected people in India, do you have, your government has kind of diplomatic energies to engage in Myanmar affairs?
Thank you, Sukjung, for initiating this and getting us to debate about this crisis in Myanmar. And you started with I think a very interesting question you posed. I mean, with pandemic ravaging the entire almost half of the cities in India, and we are in a especially last 15 days has been really bad in the sense that in major cities like Delhi, Mumbai, I mean people are running out of medicine, hospitals, and and it looks like almost like a near state collapse. So we are actually in the middle of a big crisis. But I think for a country, India is quite familiar to this sort of tragedies, and it's always somehow finds in right time to get out of it. So hopefully we'll actually come out of it. But this doesn't mean that we suspend our diplomacy and other things, because it's a large country and we have our own institutional mechanism to continue the path that we have been pursuing with Myanmar. There are a couple of things that I would say that, like you said about, the leverage. I think India of 1980s and India of now, is a completely different, sort of beast, I would say. India has many leverage, in fact, with Myanmar. In fact, that's what I think I and Maiko, we wrote in a piece for foreign policy that how India and Japan have a variety of leverages with this country. Not only with trade and economy, it's also about issues of the proximity with the junta, in the military junta, and they have a long also kind of investment in terms of strengthening democratic institutions. Both India and Japan have invested a lot actually, especially since the opening of political space in 2011 onward. So that all that actually would actually come handy, provided there is political will, and that is where I'll actually come. India, like not many countries in a position like India, because it shares a long border with Myanmar, more than 1,300 kilometers border, and we have 1,000 years of relationship, especially our northeast states, like Mizoram, Nagaland, other thing. They have ethnic, they have family relations, and and thousands of every day they go to the other side and do their work and come back. And so in a sense, it's a very different sort of situation for us to tackle. With regard to the crisis since February, India has actually in a crisis like this, where actually it would require considerable intervention, India has actually for a long time actually has settled between kind of a activist to agnostic kind of sort of stance. And here in this case, it has taken, I think, a sort of I would say very agnostic, very passive kind of it's quietly doing a lot of things. But then if you look at if an outsider would actually try to analyze and understand India's role, being one of the biggest regional powers and sharing so much of pay with the country like Myanmar, India hasn't actually done enough. In a sense, if you look at February, soon after the coup, it made a statement, very kind of usual official sort of statement, saying that expresses deep concern and it appeals for restoration of democracy and peace in that country. And then it played a significant role, of course, in bringing both West as well as Russia and China in the UN Security Council to issue a kind of statement, because that was not possible for several days, because Russia and China, they were against any kind of condemnation to the coup. So but India played a role, and they issued a kind of sort of statement, which of course it doesn't help in any way, but at least that was possible because of India's active role. And then of course India has been playing quite a significant role in the United Nations Human Rights Council, and also in pushing the Assistant Secretary to visit and sort of start kind of a process in Myanmar. So behind the scene, India has been doing quite a bit, and also it is also in many ways trying to get Indonesia and few other countries from ASEAN to play a more proactive role in the peace process. And especially India is banking a lot actually on this 5-point agenda, of ASEAN, and it also believes that as ASEAN centrality hopefully will, be in some way or other find a sort of play instrumental role, like it played in the earlier case of, making sort of a peaceful transition. So India is hoping that some of the countries like Indonesia will play a major role, because India's role actually in many ways limited largely because of the geopolitical concern. Because 1988 India played a major role actually in Myanmar's the coup, and then the struggle that were happening, democratic struggle, and India was openly supporting the people who are protesting and fighting for the democracy, and that actually led severe consequences when the junta finally ruled the country for several years. India had to pay a heavy price, because India was in many ways neglected and sidelined by the country, and then India faced a lot of insurgency in its bordering states, and junta played a role in terms of supporting many of the Chinese initiatives which went against India's. So in a sense, geopolitics and the security interest, all that actually made India to toe a line and change a line, and in many ways it basically stood as an observer. But this particular incident, India is actually ready to play a role, and it wants to be seen as a counterweight, to China as a sort of democratic force. But then we have our peculiar problem in the domestic setup. We have a kind of, for last 6-7 years, nationalistic tone in the political sphere, and we have a sort of government that actually would like to take a kind of risk-averse kind of, it doesn't want to put its egg actually with the democratic forces, and and then probably face similar consequences. So it's basically conscious of 1988 kind of incidents, and it doesn't want to, the kind of political space it has regained over the years vis-a-vis with China, it doesn't want to lose that way. So I think real politics, geopolitics is playing a major role in constraining India's say. But the couple of interesting development which also puts India in a very tight spot, and that is also forcing in some way India to take a sort of call on Myanmar. It cannot just sit idle and expect others to play the ball. For instance, our northeastern states, Mizoram, especially Mizoram, which shares a long border with Myanmar. So there are thousands of refugees have actually landed there, in Mizoram, and at least 24 or 25 NLD lawmakers are now camping in Mizoram. And this has actually created a lot of problem between the junta, military junta, and the Indian government, because junta is demanding, send them back actually. But Indian government initially, was thinking what to do, actually other thing, and there was a lot of pressure from the military. But that there were, when the news started spreading in Delhi that in India might actually send them back, so there was a massive protest within our media and civil society. Even opposition politicians also said this will be very bad to send them back, and we should not actually just concede to the junta's demand, because this is a conflict situation in which many of these people will be persecuted and penalized, and some of them may be killed by the junta. So it is not a good thing, and that finally the government actually had to buckle under the pressure. And now Mizoram, what's happening is that interesting thing is that Mizoram state, which is part of the ruling coalition at the center in New Delhi, is actually has gone against the federal government, and it says that it will openly support the peace process and the democratic process protest there. And other states like smaller states like Nagaland and others also have joined Mizoram. So we have a very interesting, the regional forces, the states, the sub-national identity is actually now taking a prominent sort of and putting some kind of generating some kind of pressure on the national government. So it will be seen in days to come how India actually ultimately come out and issue more proactive stance. So, but at the moment we are actually very depending on quiet diplomacy and aligning with other friends in the Quad and also with Indonesia and others to see that there is a breakthrough.
Thank you, Niranjan. I guess compared to other panelists that you have mentioned about some geopolitical concerns and refugee concerns because the borders is so close. I think it's great to hear that all these 4 Asian democracies are responding to this crisis in Myanmar, not only from the government and also from the civil society and media. I think this is the kind of moment for the concerned stakeholders to think about not only just Myanmar and also the democracy in the region overall, because if we cannot stop this military violence, and if we fail to put back Myanmar to the previous track for the democratizations, we'll see another blow of the backsliding of democracy in our region, because many military leaders will be emboldened to wage another coup d'etat, and also the authoritarian government and autocratic government can strengthen their power because they see the regional organization and international community, including UN, are incapable of stopping their ambition. So this is a very critical moment. And so for the second round of discussion, so what else we should do? Because I see obviously there's no nice coordination of the policy measures across the government, despite although the Indonesia has done that kind of role inside the ASEAN members, but not for South Korean government or Japanese government and even Indian government. Even though Niranjan has mentioned your government has done something with the Japanese government, I think we need to scale up this kind of concerted actions to support the people in Myanmar and restore democracy in Myanmar. So, Michael, what shall we do from now on?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think other panelists would have much to say about government's policies. So, well, actually, let me focus on the civil society side. And let me make 3 proposals focused on civil society's roles. First, continued civil society advocacy and financial support for the people of Myanmar will be a key. Although none of the Asian democracies are willing to endorse the Tatmadaw-led government, open support for the national unity government in the CDM is considered sensitive by our governments. Therefore, in the event our governments hesitate to play open roles, civil society should play complementary and supportive roles for the government. One of the biggest challenges for the CDM is financial, apparently. And that's exactly where civil society help is needed. Therefore, for example, such a fundraising campaign called 1-to-1 CDM campaign, which is to support the salaries of civil servants in Myanmar participating in CDM. So I encourage all of us to consider participating in such a campaign. Second, continually demonstrating the messages of solidarity and support for the people of the CDM is crucial. They are under repression and are forced to hide. They feel an extraordinary fear, and it is important, so important to express solidarity with them so that we can continue to support their courage. And finally, I would like to propose amongst us, to all of us, that we set up a network of researchers, scholars in Asia who can share information and contact each other to see if there are universities among our network that can accept young refugees as students. There have been a series of raids by the Tatmadaw against Democrats and ethnic armed forces. And a great number of people are crossing the border into Thailand or internally displaced. Their lives should be respected. If there is something we, the private actors, can do for them that government actors cannot do, we should cooperate with the government. In particular, young people in Myanmar of the Generation Z are at the core of the movement, and their lives are in danger. As university faculty members who are in charge of people in this age group, we can work together to set up a system to accept them into our universities. This will help globalize our universities and our domestic students as well. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Michael. Actually, the EAI held another conference, mainly with the Korean stakeholders and some Myanmar students studying inside South Korea. And many Korean people were asking, we'd like to help. How can you help? So your idea of this one-to-one, the sending funding, some resources is a good idea, but I think we need a certain organization to play a mediating role. So maybe you can get a good advice. Okay, and now Professor Kim Han-jun.
Okay, I think measures can be divided into bilateral and multilateral diplomatic and economic options. The first three bilateral options. The first, the human rights is a broad concept, and then each country has a specific focus on human rights diplomacy. The Korea have focused on the protection of the vulnerable population, such as women and children and refugees. Due to the widespread and then complexity of the issue, the Myanmar case cuts across various fronts. Therefore, the democratic countries in Asia should consider a division of labor in supporting the Myanmar, depending on their emphasis. And second, due to a harsh condition in Myanmar, every country can legitimately adjust their migration or refugee policy applied to Myanmar students, workers, and residents who are already in their country. The Korea step could be the first step, and then which guaranteed Myanmar's safety by extending their stay. A concerted migration and refugee policy by democratic countries will send a strong message to the military. And third, a bilateral ODA is another way the individual country can send message to the military and the civil society. The economic situation is worsening in Myanmar, and then the countries should direct their ODA to support the civil society and democratic movement groups directly and enhance the monitoring mechanisms, maybe through the ASEAN envoy or other regional partners or the international organization to oversee their ODA. Second, some multilateral options. The best way is to start from the international human rights conventions, which the Myanmar themselves is a state party to. The first one is, of course, the 2012 ASEAN Human Rights Declaration. And then the next step is the international conventions on women, CEDAW, and then children, CRC, and then peoples with a disability, which the Myanmar is a state party to. What is common in both regional and international conventions are the women and children. And then the proportion of the women in the protest are high. And then the number of women and the children victims are also appalling. The international society should eventually hold the military accountable for those atrocities committed by them. But first, they can start from documenting and then pressuring what the Myanmar itself has committed to comply. The second multilateral option is a body with the most effective measure tool is a UN Security Council, of course, but it is now in the gridlock due to the China and Russia. The China has specifically pronounced their objection to the Security Council's involvement in the Foreign Minister Wang Yi's 3 support and 3 avoid statement. The democratic countries should press the Security Council to act further using other UN human bodies such as General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, or the treaty bodies. The history shows that the UN's inability to issue a meaningful resolution condemning the Khmer Rouge during the Cambodian genocide is clearly remembered, and then this should not be repeated in our time. Lastly, multilateral option is democratic countries should pressure both the US and China on the issue so that both countries could change their current course of action. In the US, there is an increasing outcry to take the more effective measures, which is sanctioning the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise. And then this involves the Chevron, number 2 energy company in the US, who are actively lobbying the government not to take any further actions. I think only the public pressure is the hope at this point in the United States. And then because the United States takes the middle class diplomacy, and then depending on the middle class opinions, therefore, the democratic countries should persuade the so-called middle class in the United States. China, on the other hand, should be further pressed and then shamed on their inaction and then obstruction at the UN Security Council. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, China has the leverage in Myanmar affairs because it's the number 1 country the Myanmar is exporting and number 1 country the Myanmar is importing from. And also it has the Belt and Road investment in Myanmar. So it has a lot of leverage, but they are very strong about the non-intervention principle. The countries are not of us are are not engaging, are not talking to China at all about this Myanmar issues. Okay, Evan and some people, I'm reading questions from our participants, and one of the participants has raised the issue, your meeting of the last Saturday ASEAN summit, and he said, or he or she said, actually, after the meeting, there is a more, again, the balance, military balance, got strengthened. So whether that was a good idea or it was a legitimate, that kind of questions.
Thank you. First of all, as I said in the earlier session, we had to try something. This is not, again, not the solution yet. This is the beginning of a potential solution. We could just all go home and not do anything as well. That's an option as well. Because if, let's say, we simply sit back and let things unfold and we feel good by condemning people and supporting one side over the other, we can do that as well. But there is no guarantee of a potential diplomatic a breakthrough. So I am the first person to acknowledge that the 5-point consensus is far from perfect. It's not. It is only the foundation for a potential framework. And yes, time is of the essence for us to immediately announce the special envoy and get them to commit to the framework. As of today, it's still the only option on the table. And when the day comes when we give up, in terms of the fact that ASEAN cannot do anything anymore, then we will have to acknowledge that ASEAN has failed. But up until this point, it is true that there is a concern that the regime can walk back its commitment, implicitly accepted at the meeting, and violence can continue. Which is why I think the whole point of the next step is to get support for ASEAN's efforts to announce the framework as soon as possible, to get support in terms of funding for aid delivery, and so forth and so on. So the whole point right now is to precisely to make sure that the junta doesn't take back its commitment, and that we can actually first and foremost end violence. And I think this goes back to the earlier discussions. At the track 2 level, aside from civil society, what I would like to suggest is that there is a network long established both in Southeast as well as Southeast and East Asia of policy think tanks and policy experts working closely with the track 1 folks to formulate options. And this has been activated to various extent before the summit, and hopefully this can continue after the summit. So aside from the personal and the civil society support, I think feeding options on terms of how we can move forward, I think is something that's worth trying as well. Right now, I'm afraid there is no option that's too bad. We have to try everything that we can and make sure that we leave no stone unturned. On the track 1 level, I just want to say that right now we've seen this game before. This is not our first dance with the Myanmar issue. Sanctions have been tried before in various ways. It didn't work. Nobody wants to invoke R2P because nobody can deliver the UN Security Council. China has endorsed ASEAN's option because it saves them from doing the hard work themselves. Russia is certainly not going to care about reputational costs, no matter how many times you shame them. So does China. So for now, I'm afraid pressure should be fine in different ways, but pressure alone without providing an off-ramp of how we can actually negotiate and end violence would also be pointless. So if I can plead for the track 1 support is right now, if the goal is to end violence and start dialogue, the best of the worst option right now is ASEAN. So if Japan, if South Korea, if Russia, India, China, and even the US and European countries can get behind the ASEAN efforts to at least try to support and implement the 5-point consensus, then maybe we can get somewhere. If that doesn't work, we have to find other options. In fact, one of the things that we were discussing at the track 2 level before the summit is actually what happens if the summit fails? How do we save the package of humanitarian aid, pause, and dialogue through non-ASEAN means? So we shouldn't get hung up on the mechanics, but we should be focusing on the outcomes that we want to achieve. And if ASEAN can deliver, great. If not, then we have to find other options. So right now, I think for me is to find ways to increase the support for the ASEAN option, but also make sure that we can do it effectively, correctly, and as quickly as possible, precisely because the ideas that we propose today may be obsolete in 2 months if violence escalates even further. So we fully agree that time is of the essence.
Thank you, Evan. I think most of us would agree to your suggestion that ASEAN must be the central stage to negotiate and to engage dialogue with the military in Myanmar. However, there is a Quad, the network of USA and Japan and India and Australia. And the Quad is talking not only just hard security, it is talking also pandemic and also rule of law. So Niranjan, any sign of talk inside the Quad about this situation in Myanmar?
Yeah, that's very interesting point you raised about the Quad. In fact, the piece that we wrote in March is about Quad. Whether Quad this could be one of the finest tower of Quad which still remains a concept, and whether it can actually really push and show some bring some result. And Myanmar could be a fine case because this is about also democracy. So in a sense, what we have actually seen so far, Quad, finally you had a summit level meeting, and then foreign minister level meeting also have been accomplished, and then several other, I think Quad meetings are actually in the process actually, and this should actually eventually happen. But a lot of this thing also depends upon the political will. Of the individual countries, like India or Japan, because ultimately, the United States might use its, capacity and, sort of global presence and, push certain things, but it stays much far away. It's not really affected what's happening in our neighborhood and, in the Southeast Asia and, in Asia. I think here we are the primary stakeholders, whether it's, about Indonesia or India or Japan or the thing in Asia, we actually have to somehow, apart from ASEAN, playing a major role, Asian centrality has to come. I think this is where we have to intensify whatever, possible at different level. I think we should not, what even Lakshman said clearly, that one should not just put all the eggs actually in ASEAN, this thing baskets and, then wait some miracle happen. That may not happen actually. So time is to diversify, and even micro level intervention, micro level initiatives also holds a lot of hope, which actually not many people think, because this is not sexy, or would actually get headlines. For instance, I would say in Indian case, the couple of things that India can actually leverage and probably see build some kind of pressure on the junta. One of them is, of course, the Northeast factor. Northeast factor, there are several states which, share the border with Myanmar, and they actually could be, in many way used by India to put a kind of pressure, because already, more than 24 NLD MPs are, sheltering, and, a lot of initiative about the national unity government are also taking place from there in Mizoram. And then there is also kind of a sort of pressure that can build through the, civil society and many groups, especially Mizo Council and, number of youth groups actually very active in those states, and they're openly supporting a similar kind of, sort of movement that happened in the 1980s. So I'm saying that India can use as a sort of bargaining chip with the junta, and showing that, if you don't actually find a solution or other thing, this might go out of hand. We can't control, because refugee problem became a major headache in the February and March, when thousands started pouring in, and India was actually at a loss, although, tried to restrain, but it couldn't. So that could be one. Second, I think India and many other countries which actually have been, selling, arms to Myanmar. India, in fact, one of the largest, seller of the arms to the regime. And there, India actually can play a role, actually, in a sense that, for several years, actually, the junta is not kind of, comfortable buying, Chinese arms, because they feel it's low quality and their dependence also, they have to reduce the dependence. That's how it has, now diversified to Russia and, other kind of army. So India actually can also play sort of a role there, in many ways to put a pressure on junta. And the third, I think, most important thing that is happening in a sense, what we are seeing in the context of Quad is that both India and Japan, with their, long sort of linkages with military as well as the civilian government, including NLD and other actors, have an opportunity to actually push some kind of, to diversify their engagement. It's not necessarily only that you should put all your this thing with the junta, but with NLD, even with the ethnic groups, many of those are actually taking prominent role. In fact, in India, there is a lively debate that, why India should not actually talk to the ethnic groups and several, even the ethnic armies, like the Arakan, the Kachin and others who are actually raising it, and today we are almost in a situation in which it looks like a state collapse in Myanmar. So to prevent that and to ensure that that would lead a devastation in the country. So they are actually, I think, Asian powers can actually use their cards very, very, proactively and judiciously, and they should not just wait and watch and, and then they expect that, outside, powers, especially from America or the European Union, come and play a role. I don't think that role can happen at any point. I mean, that timing, that context is very different, and I don't think all of them are preoccupied with their own, domestic troubles. So I think Asian have to take a much proactive role, and this Myanmar crisis opens a very, very, rare opportunity to do that. Apart from, democratic level through think tanks, different organizations, I think governments must be also, pressured, and these governments have to actually come out from their cocoon and, take a stand.
Thank you, Niranjan. Actually, I'm trying to collect the questions from the audience, but there are not many questions. And there is one like, is there any reactions of resistance from the Burmese embassies and communities based in your countries? Anyone who can respond to these questions? Any reaction from the Myanmar embassy in your country, or any the community of Myanmar people in your country? Anyone?
Yeah.
Okay, Professor Kim first.
Yeah, since I mentioned about the protest in front of the Burmese embassy and then Indonesian embassies, as far as I know, there has been no official reaction from the Burmese embassies regarding the protest. But I think in terms of the community, the Burmese students and then the residents and some of the workers here are very active in promoting and then feeding the information about the first-hand information from the locals and then the friends and the families and then to the Korean community. And then they are really in front and then very upfront in various occasions and then actively raising their voices.
Yeah, thank you. I was very much impressed, how they can, I mean, the Myanmar people reside in Korea, they command the good Korean, so there's no problem at all communicating with the Korean media and Korean people. I was surprised. And other panelists, okay, Michael?
Sure, thank you. The Burmese community in Japan has been very active from the very beginning, trying to persuade the Japanese government to play some role to solve the crisis in Myanmar. And over the time, it's becoming more and more critical, being sort of not happy about the very slow move on the side of the Japanese government. And they've been meeting Japanese Diet members and Japanese policymakers to push actually those policymakers directly. But it seems that the amassing of the criticism is becoming sort of trauma for the Japanese policymakers as well. And so maybe more sort of better way would be to both provide like support or like warm kind of messaging to the Japanese government to hope for its greater role, as well as keeping it accountable.
Thank you, Michael. Since we don't have further questions from participants, let me ask to Evan. I guess many Asian democracies understanding, dialogue and diplomacies are important over just harsh sanctions in order to induce the Myanmar military to engage in dialogue and look for the kind of exit solution. However, is there any effort from your government or the ASEAN Secretary Office in Jakarta to outreach other Asian countries like Japan or Korea and India? Then you can have a more wider network from Asia about this matter.
Yes, we did. From the beginning of the coup, our foreign minister had various phone calls and meetings online as well as on-site to get support for the ASEAN approach. In Japan, when we visited Japan, we met with the Japan Special Envoy for Myanmar, the chair of the Nippon Foundation, I think. And then we had a phone conversation as well with the Secretary of External Affairs of India. We've had various meetings and phone calls with the Chinese, Russia. We also made outreach and communication. The issue is, of course, that a lot of these outreach and communication before the ASEAN leaders meeting were still quite broad. It wasn't very detailed in terms of the proposal, right? Because that's what we're trying to get at right now. But we were sort of conveying that we would like your support for an ASEAN approach. And I think as far as the public statements are concerned, there is that support. And after the summit as well, Japan made a statement of support, the US as well, China, I'm not sure about India and others, but I do think there is an outreach of communication. Australia has also pledged $5 million to support the 5-point consensus through the ASEAN Humanitarian Center, the AHA Center. So there is, I think, a deliberate effort before and after the meeting to engage a wider set of countries beyond ASEAN. Now, the issue, of course, is two things. One, there is one thing to suggest it's not just about support, but can those countries that we reach out to will actually use their leverage if things don't work out? To what extent can China say, okay, we support ASEAN? That's not the same thing as China will put pressure on Myanmar. It's not the same thing as Japan or India are trying to put pressure if things don't work out. So support versus use of leverage, I think, is something that we don't know yet. Secondly, we hope that in the framework that ASEAN will develop in the coming days, if not weeks, that there is going to be a significant role for the international community beyond ASEAN to facilitate this process, whether it's through some sort of ASEAN special fund, which we created, for example, after the Cyclone Nargis in 2008, I believe. This will allow us to pool resources to help the people of Myanmar. Or do we see this in terms of a future dialogue in which we can create a mechanism for ASEAN with the international community to facilitate that dialogue? Or whether we reach out to specialized UN agencies to provide support during the humanitarian assistance phase. So this depends on how soon and how quickly the special envoy can be announced, the framework of engagement to be decided upon, and how quickly we can act on that. Then I think this helps address that first question, whether support from regional countries equals to them actually using their leverage to put pressure on the Myanmar side.
Thank you very much. Since time is up, actually there was two more questions. And if I read just one, that was how the civil society organization can influence their government respectively to demand further actions. I guess in case of South Korea CSOs are very active in demanding their government to respond and also to demand POSCO to divest the investment. So I think they are very active. And also another question was about whether there are additional sanctions, because economic sanctions don't seem to work. So that was the question, whether there are alternative ways to press the military in Myanmar. Well, if one of panelists want to respond briefly about the more effective and additional sanctions, I'm willing to spend 1-2 minutes more.
I just want to add about the civil society question somebody raised. I think, I mean, as I said earlier, India's case is a very classic case, how the policy which was looking very sort of passive in the initial weeks actually of the coup is now taking a far more proactive kind of, traction in India is largely has come through civil society organizations pressure from the northeastern states, the Mizoram Council and, Mizoram students organizations and Naga students organizations are actually actively pressuring the government, especially their subnational governments, to pressure the federal government, take a more proactive stand and engage with the, protesters and, support them financially and, morally, and take off this issue more proactively in the sense that they say, which is now getting, with the national media also, picking up these stories and, trying to highlight, especially on the issues of refugees, people who are thousands of who are fleeing from Myanmar and, sheltering. And then when the government of India issued the kind of, the Home Ministry issued, a month back saying that, those people should not be encouraged to enter India. So that led to a lot of backlash in those states saying that, this is not sort of kind of, this should be handled with more sensitivity because people are not just jumping, border for fun. They are actually coming, because their life is under threat. So that actually made a lot of changes in the government stance, and it also brought the Supreme Court to the also scene in a sense, because Supreme Court felt that India doesn't have a refugee law. So which means that it makes us morally and in many ways, legally bound to, support such people, other thing, because otherwise their life is in danger. So it also warned the federal government that not to take any such, steps that can jeopardize their lives, other thing. So I'm saying civil society can play a great role, and many ways actually we have all actually thought many of these, solution of to this sort of problem can be only brought by the great powers, or involvement of, only regional organization. I think at individual level, at civil society level, there could be a lot of actually things that can, move. But provided there is a collective kind of, or joint efforts, and there is, seamless coordination among different, actors involving several, Asian democracies. I think that's where I think we should aim to pitch some of these examples, and probably bring more sort of unity in purpose, and and intensify these sort of initiatives.
Thank you very much. I think time is up, so let me wrap up in this way. I have three takeaways from our discussion. Number one, for Asian democracies, both government and the civil society actually will waken up to the crisis in Myanmar. And there are, of course, different engagement. Japan is taking more quiet diplomacy, and Korea taking more assertive and very vocal diplomacy. But nevertheless, we see there is a lack of coordinated action across the democratic government in the region. And second, we are glad to see the civil society of 4 countries are all attentive to this situation, and they want to help the people in Myanmar to restore their democracy. And there must be a lot of work for them and support for the civil society organization and individuals. And number 3, for the regional organization, we all agree ASEAN must be center of constructive engagement with the military in Myanmar. And of course, other Asian democracies should support and back all these diplomatic efforts of ASEAN. However, we also need to expand our democratic support network to European countries, EU, and America outside the region of Asia. Well, I wish we can organize another webinar after things got improved in several months. I hope that opportunity come very soon in near future. Thank you very much for participating and sharing this wonderful discussion. And also I'd like to thank President Ramos Horta for delivering very excellent, encouraging keynote speech. Thank you. Bye-bye.